Hello, and thank you for tuning in to a brand new episode of Crowsdale's very own talk show, Know Your Neighbor. I'm your host, Caroline from Life Enrichment. Thank you for tuning in over the past month of November as we paused our usual programming to feature previously recorded interviews with some of Crowsdale's veterans. We hope you enjoyed learning more about these heroes. Now we're back with a full schedule of brand new interviews with some of Crowsdale's very own residents. Today's guest was personally suggested by multiple viewers of the show. A few episodes ago, I asked you all to please let me know if there was anyone you wanted to see interviewed. Thank you so much to those of you who sent suggestions. Please keep them coming. A popular name among those suggestions was our very own Mr. Riggs, who's joining me today. You may know Mr. Riggs from being here at the community, and hopefully you know a little bit about his past at the Ackland Museum in Chapel Hill. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the show as we learn a lot more about Mr. Riggs. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me.
It's so nice to have you here. I've been looking forward to this, and we even added a little holiday cheer for your episode. So, Mr. Riggs, I want to start by asking you the same question that I've asked every guest we've had so far this year, and that is, how are you doing?
Well, I consider myself, in the present circumstances, to be very lucky. Chiefly because I am living in one small house with the woman I love best in the world. And if I could have one wish, it would be to have an afternoon with the woman I love next best in the world, who is my daughter. She and her husband and young son are living in England now. So although we got to pay them a visit, fortunately, before the epidemic, she would be pretty inaccessible even if we were not in the midst of COVID, but we Skype every week.
That was going to be my next question, was if you were communicating via technology. I'm glad you've been able to do that.
All kinds of things. There are meetings with local groups that Carolyn, my wife, and I are involved with. And so we've gotten very much used to Skype and Zoom.
Well, I'm so glad that you did mention your lovely wife, because if you have not asked how these two met, Mr. Riggs and his lovely wife, Carolyn, do yourself a favor and ask about their romantic journey that led them to where they are now, living here at Crowsdale. It was one of the best stories I've ever heard. And I just think that maybe the two of you should come on this show together sometime and tell that story to everyone. But if you haven't asked, that's your homework, to find these two and ask how they met.
Just don't do it if you have only 5 minutes to spare.
It'll be worth the time, though. I can promise it's worth the time. So let's start at the very beginning. We heard how you're doing now. Let's hear what led you up to this point. Where were you born and raised, and what was your childhood like?
Well, I was born in New Haven, Connecticut. My parents lived in that area for 4 years after I was born. Then we lived in Massachusetts for a while, and when I was 12, my father got a job at the University of Buffalo, and we went out to Western New York. I had two sisters, one of whom was 3 years younger and one 5 years, so I spent the early years as an only child. And I think I have very clear memories of those years. And I have a feeling that my focus on objects may have gotten started then. I have very intense memories of the spaces in that house, the little toys that I had to play with, and I spent a lot of time alone. My father was at work, my mother was a writer, and I had a lot of time to wander around the house and play by myself.
Do you think that childhood, you touched on this, your fascination with objects, do you think that shaped the man you became professionally?
I have a strong suspicion that it did. Not that I intended to become an art historian as a child, or really to have anything much to do with art. My father was in science. He was interested in almost every kind of science there was, and very little else. And he could be very entertaining talking about, to a child, talking about things to do with astronomy or biology. Going on a walk with him was always a treat because there were all sorts of things, insects, leaves, plants, animals, minerals. Whatever we came across, he could say something about it. And I frankly took it for granted as a child growing up that I would be some kind of scientist because there didn't seem to be really anything else that was important to do.
And it sounds like your dad made science sound really interesting. So I can see why a young Mr. Riggs would have been interested in that.
He made it fascinating, yes. I think I may have had a tendency that way anyway. And the interesting thing is that my transition from science to art, there was a bridge there.
Tell me about that. So you've talked a little bit about your childhood, and then you went to school. You thought maybe you'd be a scientist one day. Like you said, you weren't a little boy running around saying, I want to be an art historian when I grow up. If there is a little boy running around saying that, I'd like to meet them. What was your sort of educational journey like? Did you go into studying the sciences? And if so, when did you pivot towards art?
I can date that quite precisely. In high school, I took a course in biology and general science. I did not take courses in physics or chemistry because my father advised me to wait until I was in college and get it in a more serious mode. But I went to college, as a freshman with the notion that I would start filling in my scientific background, and I took a course in physics. And I found that there was a block in my relating to what I was learning in physics. I think it has something to do with the fact that I'm interested in mathematical things, but only in certain ways and at certain levels. And I became very seriously confused in first year physics. By the end of the year, I still assumed that I was going into science, but I figured it had to be a less mathematical science. And with my father's interests, I gravitated to biology. Now, my next year, I was out of college because my father had a sabbatical, and we all went to England where he was working on a book. As a rising sophomore, I could not study at an English university, but a friend of my father's told me that I could study at the University of Geneva, and not as a formal student, but as an auditor, and I could get grades marked in that position. So I talked to the biology chairman at Swarthmore, my college, and he said, you bring a certificate back and we'll credit you with first year biology. So I found myself living alone in Geneva. And I should also mention that I had taken a course in art history. I'd taken one course in high school and liked it very much indeed, and a semester as a freshman in college. And I loved the idea of art history. But it seemed to me that this was not something, whereas in science, things were clear and you might be confused about a particular thing, but it was within a framework that was comprehensible. And art seemed to be this spiritual realm where you needed, it was almost as though you had to have the dove of the Holy Spirit descending on you. And it hadn't happened to me. And so I remember sitting in the library one time and seeing a student across from me looking at an art book and looking at pictures and then making notes. And I thought, how can you do that just from a picture? But while I was at the University of Geneva, a friend of mine sent me a Christmas present, and that was a book called Principles of Art History that had been written by a German in the early 20th century. And that book treated works of art the way that a biologist treats specimens. And he would say, you know, this is why, in general, works of art in Europe, he was just covering Europe, works of art produced in the 17th century look different from works of art produced in the 16th century, whether they were produced in the Netherlands or in Germany or in Italy. On the other hand, works of art produced in Italy are going to look different from works produced in Northern Europe. And he would describe the works that were illustrated in the book, and I would look and I would say, yes, I see. What he says is there is there. And that had not always been the case with other books on art history that I had read. They'd say, oh, you know, so-and-so, he responds so beautifully to. And I thought, well, I don't understand how that shows up in the pictures.
Right.
But when this man said, this is this way because this figure is here and this figure is there, all of a sudden I said, yeah, that's it. And by the end of the year, I had decided, first of all, that I was going into some feature of the humanities rather than science. I had done well with my biology studies, and so I wasn't feeling that I was being chased out of science. But my heart was somewhere else, and that was with poetry, literature, and works of art. And I wrote a letter to my father late in the year and laid this all out in front of him. And my father had seen he taught in medical school, and he had seen miserable sons of doctors who were trying to follow their father's footsteps without being temperamentally suited for it. And he believed the most important thing that for his children to do was to find what they really cared about and give their lives to it. And so he responded beautifully. I wish I had that letter, but he gave me his blessing, essentially.
What a testament to your father's love and trust in you to make that decision, and as I called it earlier, a pivot, especially after growing up thinking you would work in science and also taking those classes at Swarthmore. And I think that a lot of parents could learn from that example of how to encourage your adult child when they're a student to follow their heart in what they're doing, and it will lead you to incredible places as it did with you. And I think that's an interesting example, like you said, of the miserable medical students who felt that they were supposed to be there because of what their parents did. I think that's something we can all learn from. So you got your father's blessing and had this sort of awakening, I'll call it, towards the humanities and art. What happened then? You went back to school.
Went back to school and said to my advisor, I'm going to be a humanities major instead of a science major, and suddenly discovered that there were a whole bunch of requirements for a humanities major that I had never bothered with when I was a freshman. And I had to take all these introductory courses, which essentially prevented me from taking more than an introductory course in art history that whole year. And the choice between literature and art history, I can't tell you when that happened, except that it was somewhere between, say, September and October of my sophomore year. And it was partly, one of my roommates said to me, you know, when you talk about what you want to do, you mention art history 3 times for every time you mention English literature.
Wow.
So I thought, well, that's a sign.
Definitely a sign. So I went to college myself and had friends who studied art and art history. And I know the sort of stereotypical question from parents maybe or well-meaning friends is, well, what kind of job are you going to do with this degree? Did you have any idea what you wanted to do after school and getting that degree?
Well, once I had settled on a humanities major, and specifically art history, there seemed to me to be only 2 alternatives. One would be to go into academic life, and the other would be to work in a museum. Now, I was terrified of the idea of teaching. I thought that I was incompetent at standing up in front of an audience. I have changed my mind about that,
I was about to say, look at you.
But I had no idea that I would be competent to perform as a lecturer. And I didn't know much about museum work, but I assumed that it meant being in contact with a lot of works of art. and that you might put together exhibitions. I can't honestly remember what I thought a museum curator did when I was a sophomore.
But regardless, you were interested in that
Yes.
path.
And at the same time, incidentally, it was really the following year, I took a seminar in the history of printmaking. And I had been interested, I wouldn't have taken the seminar if I hadn't been interested in that. But by the time I was halfway through that seminar, I went to the professor and said, I want to make a career in the history of printmaking. And that fit with a career in the museum world because most museums have large print collections, but within the academic world, the history of prints is a small subset of history in general. And you would not be likely to walk up to a department, an academic department, and say, I want to come and teach the history of prints. They would say, and what else?
Right.
But the question of how will you make money for this? My parents never raised it. I don't remember anybody else raising it. I didn't really think about it. I just sort of thought, well, they wouldn't teach this if it weren't good for something.
Well, you ended up in the museum world, and you did become a curator of collections. What does a curator do? You admitted maybe you weren't really sure as a student what a role like that would entail. What does a curator do? How would you describe that role in layman's terms?
Sure. Well, there are many different things that you can do in a museum. You can be a director, which involves a great deal of administration and a great deal of fundraising. You can be an educator. You can work as a guard, which is a more interesting profession than you might suppose. You can, oh dear, what was I going to say? An essential museum-connected profession is what we call a conservator. That is to say, someone who keeps, I like to say the conservator is like a physician for works of art. If they are damaged, if they are deteriorating, the conservator is somebody who has the specialties in chemistry and the physical dexterity to do things to repair them.
Wow.
And also the knowledge to see that the museum environment is designed so that the works will deteriorate as little as possible, as long as possible. Has to do with lighting, it has to do with temperature and humidity, and a variety of other things. So I like to say the conservator is the person who looks after the bodies of the works of art in the collection. The curator is the one who looks after their souls. That is to say, curators are responsible for acquiring works of art for the museum, expanding its collection, for designing exhibitions, arranging works of art in the galleries, long-term or short-term. If you are a specialist in prints, you don't put anything up permanently because prints are all more light sensitive than other works of art. And so a print curator, the life of a print curator is pretty much a series of exhibitions all through his career. I don't remember how many exhibitions I did, but there was a booklet that the staff prepared for me when I retired. And the list of exhibition was something over 100.
Wow.
And so the Ackland Art Museum has a collection of, physics, numbers. Anyway, let's say 18,000 works of art, of which perhaps half or more than half are works on paper, prints and drawings and photographs. And those were that was the part of the collection that I was most knowledgeable about. Now, the Ackland Art Museum is a small museum, and there was only one curator of collections. And so I was responsible not only for the works on paper, but for, I have written labels for African carvings, for Greek and Roman sculpture, for Chinese ceramics. One of the joys of working at a really small museum is that you get to be a non-specialist. Now, some people would much prefer to go to a place like the Metropolitan and spend their entire life on one group,
Right.
one period of art, one medium, prints or sculpture or silver. But I have been very grateful for the opportunity to work with all kinds of different things from many cultures and many ages.
I'm just sitting here intrigued by your story, and I love the way that you talk about those different roles in a museum setting and how each of them does something different. And like you said, the curator, it's about the soul. And we need that on a T-shirt or something.
Well, I don't want to push that too hard, because that smacks of the kind of art history that was turning me off when I got started.
That's true. You said you loved the more scientific language about art. Okay, so we'll rethink that T-shirt, but I'll get on that. So, like you mentioned, you ended up at Ackland in Chapel Hill. How did you land there? And tell us a little bit about your time there. I know you were there for a while and a beloved member of that team and that community. Tell us a little bit more about Ackland for those who aren't familiar with the museum.
Okay. Well, I've already said the Ackland is a small museum. Mm-hmm. It is also a museum with wide-ranging collections. Sometimes when people ask me, I say the Ackland Art Museum is an encyclopedic museum. If you will accept the fact that there is such a thing as a pocket encyclopedia. We obviously don't have either anything like the number of objects that, say, the Metropolitan Museum has, nor do we have the variety. There are entire ranges of art history which are completely or almost completely unrepresented in the collection. But there is enough variety that you can talk about the history of art from ancient times, at least the, let's say, 500 BC, although there are things that are older than that, up to the 20th and 21st centuries. And in different places, different times, you will be emphasizing different things. We have a small collection of African art, which is mostly 20th century, although there are a few older pieces. We have a larger collection of European and American art, with European from the late Middle Ages to the present, with American not much before the 18th century and not much of that, mostly 19th and 20th century. But there are all these different things, and one of the great things about working in a small museum is that as curator of collections, if I wanted to make an exhibition on a theme that involved me pulling out photographs, painted porcelain, prints and drawings, a painting or two, and showing how the same idea worked out of different aspects of each object, I had no trouble. It didn't have to be an interdepartmental diplomatic conference to get those objects into the same space.
I was doing a little research, trying to understand better before talking to you what a curator does. I was simultaneously doing some research on you, as any amateur reporter does, of course.
I hope the professionals do too.
I wouldn't be so sure about that. But I found this quote from you that was really helpful to me. In 2010, you said, "A museum is like a cocktail party. Some of the guests are the works of art. Some of the guests are the museum visitors. The curators and staff act as the hosts, getting the two to mingle." I love that. Can you tell me a little bit more about what you meant when you gave that analogy describing the cocktail party?
Well, I can't remember when it occurred to me, but I'm just delighted that you found that quote and you picked it up, because I have said it many times, but I didn't remember that it had ever been written down.
Oh, it is in print.
But as a museum curator, you become aware that there are many people who are uncomfortable in museums.
Yes.
And I thought to myself, well, I know a situation where I am uncomfortable, and that is almost any kind of party. I mean, cocktail party par excellence. But the idea of walking into a room full of people that I don't know and somehow relating to them, it still makes me very anxious. Mm-hmm. And I thought, well, what if we look at the museum as a kind of cocktail party, and where a lot of people I know have the same reaction to the museum that I have to the party. Yeah. And as I've developed this, I say, suppose you were to go to a party and your host comes up to you at the door and says, you know, there are some extremely important people here today. It would be very valuable to you if you got to know them, and then walks off. Well, my inclination in a situation like that would be to walk off in the opposite direction, back home.
Yes.
But if the host leads you up to a particular person and says, this is so-and-so, and he has worked, he's a lawyer by profession, and I know that you were reading something concerning law, and you might be interested to hear what he has to say about that. Well, that involves you.
Yes.
And, you know, to go back to the tasks of a curator, one of the primary tasks from my point of view is the task of writing explanatory labels.
Yes.
It's something that different people have different ideas about. Some people worry about explanatory labels. They think it would be better to have the person interacting directly with the work of art, and that a long label leads the person to read the label rather than looking at the work of art.
Huh.
And the wrong kind of label can certainly do that. I think that what I have always tried to do when I write a label is, first of all, keep it short. I had a rule of thumb because we used 18-point type in on our labels so that they're easy to read. And the labels were written on sheets of 8.5 by 11 paper. And so there was a built-in limit to the number of words that you can put on an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper when you're using 18-point type, and when the top 4 inches are taken by artist, title, medium, donor, and so forth. And knowing that you have no more than, say, 40 or 50 words, I can't remember if it's that much, to get your point across, it concentrates your mind. And you want to, and also, you don't want to talk about anything that the person won't look at the object and say, oh, is that? Yes, I see that. I mean, it's coming back to that textbook that I read. I want to have that interaction between the words and the object that's next to it.
I have trouble being a succinct writer, and I am just shuddering over here trying to think of trying to get something on one page with 18-point font. I should learn from that. I think that's something I can aspire to.
I'll lend you a couple of labels.
Thank you. Please do. I need the practice. So you were there for about 30 years. Is that right?
That's right. My career is basically summed up in 2 museums.
Right.
I had after I got my doctorate, I had a strange job that might be described as a postdoctorate fellowship. I won't go into that. It was very much connected with the history of prints. But then I got a job at the Worcester Art Museum in Massachusetts, which is a small museum also, not as big, bigger than the Ackland, but still tiny by comparison with the famous big city museums. Mm-hmm. And I told them when I came in that I wanted to specialize in prints, but that I understood I would be called upon to do all kinds of things. And I did that. Now, in connection with, while I was there at the museum, I met a woman who was a professor at Clark University and who had an idea for an exhibition that tied in with some ideas that I had. And it was more ambitious than any exhibition I'd ever done. We applied for grants. We borrowed things from many institutions in America and a couple in Europe. And we arranged for the show to be at the National Gallery, which meant it opened at the National Gallery because the National Gallery does not take a show unless they get to be first in line. And that was fine with Worcester because it meant we got publicity in advance. But at any rate, this exhibition was successful. And one of the museums it went to was the Ackland Art Museum. Oh. And that was my first connection with the museum. Coincidentally, about the time this exhibition was getting completed, I met the woman who would become my first wife, who worked at who was a student at North Carolina at UNC. And when we were thinking of getting married, it happened that a position came open at the Ackland Art Museum, and she called my attention to it because she had connections down there. And I had been 10 years at one museum, seemed like long enough, and they gave me something like a 50% raise when I went down there. So it was very tempting. That's right. I had never lived in the South, and I was a little uneasy about what that would mean. Yeah. But in fact, I settled into it quite well. And 10 years later, 20 years later, 30 years later, I was still there.
I would say, yeah, you settled in okay. In your 30 years there, the museum's gallery space doubled, the collection grew, a website and digitation project launched, your programs grew immensely, and that's just what I saw based on some quick research. And it led me to think about a museum's growth and how such a large part of that depends on the visitors and the patrons. And, so many businesses and cultural hubs, everything has been affected by COVID. And I'm sure museums have taken a huge hit since that relies on an in-person experience for a lot of that. How has the Ackland or any other cultural experiences that you know of had to pivot in this year in order to keep up engagement when a huge part of what they do is now a health and safety concern?
Well, I wish I were in a better position to answer that. I don't know much more than I read in the papers. It has been a devastating blow to museums because essentially they shut down. And there are a lot of efforts to create virtual visits. And there's a lot of electronic reaching out. And I can't tell you a lot about that. The Ackland, in the years since I left, has been through a lot of staff changes, so that there are very few people there whom I was close to at the time that I was working there. And although I've tried to keep up, and there are some people that there are people I know very well, but this is the little boy who was more interested in objects than people. I have a hard time maintaining contacts with people. One of my pieces of good fortune is that there is a man who lives in Winston-Salem who is a collector of works of art, mostly porcelain. And he walked into the museum about 10 years before I left. And I happened to be interested in decorative arts at the time because the museum had sold off a large collection of decorative arts, second-rate decorative arts, and raised a great deal of money with that. And that money was going to be spent on works of art. And I said, I think in consideration for the people who amassed those collections that we have sold, I would like to see us get some significant decorative arts. And in particular, I think a wonderful piece of 18th century porcelain might be something to acquire. Well, it just so happened that this guy, basically on his own, without an academic background, had come to know an enormous amount about things like Meissen porcelain in Germany, Sèvres porcelain. He later branched out in his collecting to the Chinese porcelain that was being exported to Europe in the 16th and 17th century, and that gave rise to the 18th century European porcelain, which was basically copying the formulas, the chemical formulas that the Chinese had used. I'm very much oversimplifying here. But at any rate, he and I have become very good friends, and we talk to each other almost every week and talk about things he's acquired. He got into the Ackland recently because he was bringing a gift there, and they took him into a gallery which has been made into an exhibition that nobody outside the museum has seen. And he went around with his camera and snapped something like 40 pictures, which he has sent to me so that I could get some idea of what the goals of this exhibition are. And he's been perhaps my best contact with the museum world since COVID shut us all down.
What advice do you have for someone who is interested in pursuing a career in the arts? You know, you may think that most of our viewers here at Crowsdale are probably not at the stage in their life where they're considering a new career. But I will say that we have heard from family members of Crowsdale residents who watch this show on YouTube. So you never know, maybe someone's grandchild or great-grandchild is watching this. What advice would you have for someone considering a profession in the arts?
Well, here again, the advice I can give, I feel, is quite limited, because I entered the museum world in 1973. A lot of time has gone by.
No, not that
And
much.
the world has changed so drastically that I have no idea what the course of my career would be if I were to enter the museum world as a 28-year-old now. There's so much to do with electronic communications. There's so much digital material. There are tremendous opportunities, but there also are things that I think have been shut off. And maintaining the contact of ordinary people with a big building full of a lot of objects, I think it's a very different task now from what it was before the internet. There are ways, I believe there are ways where the internet can make people more interested in physical objects. But it's possible that it can also make people less interested in physical objects. And I even know myself that there are certain things where I think, oh, well, I could actually see this better on a computer screen. But I'm going to bring out another of my Riggs phrases. When people have asked me, and this goes back years, when they have asked me about a career in the museum, I have said there is never a problem about getting work in a museum. The problem is to get paid for it. Museums depend a great deal on volunteers, particularly in the education department. The most museum education departments consist of one or two people who are professionals. And, well, in the case of the Ackland, perhaps a dozen or 20 who are volunteers. And that is a way to get you into a museum and to experience it. The Ackland also offers student internships to people who are at UNC, so that's another connection. And from there on, as far as Timothy Riggs goes, you're on your own. If you can talk, and there are some people who are now at the museum that I have recommended to other people as possible mentors. People who say, well, this is the way I did it.
Right.
There's a woman who came out of a background that before she came, I would have sort of assumed this is not the way you get into a significant museum job anymore. She didn't have graduate work in art history. She had worked in commercial galleries. She was very much interested in art. She had come to know a lot, but she did not have the academic credentials. Well, she has been there now for, well, certainly more than a decade. I can't remember how long. She is a curatorial assistant. She does very important work. She organizes exhibitions. She writes labels. She advises. She does many of the things that I myself did as a curator. And I think that she's found a very satisfactory career that way. I think this may happen more easily in small museums than in large museums. Although I'm sure there are opportunities for volunteer work of different kinds.
Yeah.
One of the things that makes me sad about this situation, and this is something, again, that I would never have thought of back in the 70s, but simply by saying, go and be a volunteer, you are discouraging a bunch of people who cannot be volunteers because they have to get paid
Right.
to survive.
Right.
And I don't know that the museum world has really set about solving that problem.
Yeah.
But reaching out towards people who are outside of the traditional,
Yes.
well, let's just say, the traditional WASP or Jewish
Right.
demographic
Yeah.
that was common in museums at the time I entered,
Yes.
and was also, although there was an important women's contingent, it was very much dominated by men.
Yeah.
That has changed very significantly in the years of my career. I belong to a professional organization of print curators, which was, I would say, probably 80 or 90% male when I joined. And now I would say it's majority women.
Well, there you go. Change in that way is so important. Like you said, having a more diverse community around art and museums. And you touched on sort of the intimidation that you feel, the social anxiety at a cocktail party. And I think your role as a curator and the art world's job is to take away some of that intimidation so that people of all backgrounds and all demographics can feel welcome and a space to come and learn and see beautiful art and feel as though they're meant to be there. No pressure. That's well, I just want to thank you so much for taking the time to come and chat with me, and for everyone listening. I've really enjoyed getting to hear more of your story. I feel like we could do a part 2, part 3, part 4. But thank you so much for taking the time to do this.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you, all of you out there, 10, 15, 100, however many.
Thousands, Mr. Riggs.
Thank you all for coming to listen to us
Yes.
in your various living rooms.
Exactly. It's funny talking to this empty room, but we can just imagine the millions of people tuning in. Yes, thank you for watching this episode of Know Your Neighbor. Join us each Wednesday at 4 o'clock for new episodes to air. They replay on Saturdays and Sundays. And like I said, if you have a friend like Mr. Riggs who you'd like to see on the show, please continue to send those suggestions my way. Bye.